and tonight he's going to focus in on really how the church has fared throughout its centuries with the different crises that the world has brought it through, how well it did, and the outcome of it for history. Now, tonight he's going to cover 1,500 years, so he's going to go just hit the highlights, and then tomorrow night he'll do 500 years, the other 500 years up to the present time. Each night is from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And this whole idea for tonight's topics began a long time ago, last summer, when Joni Ludwig kind of asked me, kind of threw out the question about how did, during the last pandemic of the 1918 era, we did not come out of it too well. We had the Roaring '20s, then we had the Great Depression, then World War II. And so she was wondering how we could come out of it now, but then I said, our church has dealt with an awful lot of history, a lot of different pieces, and it's come out sometimes well and sometimes not so well. And so tonight and tomorrow night, Father Joe will give us that kind of perspective of how well we have done over time. So once again, Father Joe, I welcome you back, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Can you all hear? Well, you can all hear me? Okay. Very good. And for you at home, good to see you again. We're going to have to fly a little bit because we have a lot of ground to cover. This has been a difficult year, as Bob has said, and as he raised the question with me a couple of months ago about how do we find hope in the midst of all of the challenges and crises that we're going through. And I said, well, I think we find hope in looking back at church history, because many of the challenges we have today are not new. They have happened several times before. So what can we learn from that? And their strengths and weaknesses in every era. So I'm going to try to do in these two nights the impossible task of covering 1,500 years in about an hour and a half. So I will be flying pretty quickly. There is a PowerPoint that I'm using, and I think some of you at home either have the PowerPoint or the notes that I try to prepare from the PowerPoint, so you can kind of follow if I'm going rather fast. It's kind of like what I've tried to do is looking at a family album. Happy St. Patrick's Day to all of you. I'm very grateful to my grandmother, Hannah Powers, who came from Cork, Ireland in the last century and graduated from Purdue University in 1902. I can't remember too many other women doing that. I came to discover when I was in Ireland that the Powers family were the great distillers in Ireland. I knew there was something in me blood about that. So if you haven't had any Powers Irish whiskey, I highly recommend it. But looking at that family album, as sometimes I've done with some of my family members and yours, we look back at the people that have set the ground for all of us. And that's why history is so terribly important, family history and our church family history. When I was in St. Mary's in Baltimore in graduate school in theology, obviously the late 60s, early 70s, it was right after Vatican II, and unfortunately, the professors were throwing everything at us, including the kitchen sink. But I was privileged to have some great professors, some of nationally known people, and they taught everything from a historical perspective. Sometimes it drove us crazy. Scripture scholar, well, you got to go back to pre-Old Testament, then Old Testament, through the New Testament, and then, of course, you got to look at the first century, blah, 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 so forth. And a lot of times, some of our exams were saying, trace this theme through history. Drove me crazy, but I learned a tremendous amount from that, and I think, hopefully, that will help you as well. One of the books that was powerful to me is a very little tiny book done by Yves Congar, who was one of the great giant theologians of the Second Vatican Council, an ecclesiologist, a Dominican. Later was named a cardinal, never ordained a bishop, but named a cardinal. He wrote this very small book called The Power and the Poverty of the Church. And it was written back in 1962. and he kind of showed 8 eras of the church very briefly, like tonight. And he kind of said, what do we learn strengths and weaknesses from each era of the church? And it was like a mind blower for me, and I've always been admired what he did, and I've tried to trace some of what he's tried to do in these evenings. So tonight we'll cover roughly from around 50 of the first century to 1492. I think you know what happened in 1492. Each era, we're going to go through 4 eras tonight. We'll look at those eras, some of the key events and people. Then what are the strengths? What are some of the weaknesses in that era? And then move on to the next era. I would hope that some of you will have some questions. We may not have a lot of time for questions. And those of you at home, if you've got a question, write it down. Maybe email it to Father Brendan. He said he has nothing to do in the next 24 hours. Ha ha. But we could probably maybe deal with some of those maybe tomorrow night when we're dealing with the next 4 eras. So that's what we're going to do. Are you ready? Got your seat belts buckled and all that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do the first 4 eras tonight that we're going to cover is looking at first era is the first century. That sets the groundwork. It's the era of persecutions of the church. The church is an underground church. So roughly from 50, about the time of Paul's epistles, and that era goes all the way to roughly 324. 313, the time of Constantine, when he becomes the emperor as a catechumen. That first part of the church is all pretty much an underground church for 300 years. Then we look at the second era, which is after Constantine, and the church begins to grow. And that has strengths and weaknesses in it. But also the rise of heresies, but also the rise of liturgy, also the rise of what we call the Nicene Creed comes out of this second era of the church. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire is crumbling and dividing in two. And then there are lots of other things that happen in those first couple of hundred years, from 325 to 600 roughly. The third era is what we call the Dark Ages. The barbarians invade from the north and destroy many things. Islam arrives in the Middle East and destroys much of the church's work in northern Africa and across northern Africa. But also the Germans, after a while, begin to rise and create their own Roman Empire under Charlemagne. And that leads to the turn of the millennium in the year 1000, and Gregory the Seventh is kind of a neat marking point, which begins to turn the church in another direction. Obviously, a critical area is the fourth era we'll talk about, the rise of the papacy as we know it. We think everybody called Peter the Holy Father. Nobody probably called him that. But from the Bishop of Rome to Papa, which is where we get the word Pope from, and the strength of the consolidation of the papacy during the first part of the second millennium. There's lots of spiritual renewal going on. There's also lots of corruption going on, and there's back and forth with all of that. And because of much of that corruption, we see the seeds of the Reformation. That's as far as we'll get tonight, but that's going to be long. And of course, next week we'll begin with the Reformation and the eras afterwards, just to show you what tomorrow night is. The age of Reformation into the age of Enlightenment and science, and these between Reformation, the philosophical revolution, the scientific revolution, the church gets clobbered by all of these things and doesn't always deal well with these various revolutions. That takes us up to the French Revolution, and after that, the fall of monarchies begin to collapse. And if you're looking at the Pope as a monarchy, okay, that gets threatened again, and we go into what we'll see in the 19th century with First Vatican Council, infallibility, and papal infallibility, papal primacy, and a kind of a defensive church in all of this. The seventh era we'll look at is fairly modern, is looking at 1951 to the year 2000. The last one will look at the year 2000 to the present time, 21 years later. Lots of things happen very fast in these last two eras, but those are the eras most of us here present are used to. It might be part of our own history. So let's look at the first centuries up to 324. Paul, of course, is the disciple who begins to spread the church in lots of ways. The missionary disciple that goes into what we call present-day Turkey and to Greece. Both of those were considered, Greece was both of those countries. They were Asia Minor at the time. And Paul 3 times travels through those areas and begins to set up churches in various areas. Very primitive churches in lots of ways. And of course, he's battling many things as he goes through that. But he writes letters back to those folks to support those various communities. And gradually, as he's going to the Gentiles, rather than simply Jews, originally it was Jewish Christians, and there were such things. And then Christians got thrown out of the synagogue, and Christianity began to separate from Judaism. That caused lots of problems that we still struggle with today, with anti-Semitism and all of that kind of stuff. There are roots of that at that time. So the church during this period of time is pretty loose structure. It's not anything like we think of the Vatican or all the structures we have in parishes like St Bernadette. Very loose structures, and Paul creates various people to lead the churches after he leaves and moves on to someone else. A lot of times he will leave a couple in charge of the church. Priscilla and Aquila were part of the church of Ephesus. He even had women to be head of the church. There is a record of a deacon named Phoebe, whether she's ordained as we think of it, because there wasn't really ordination in that time, as we think of it, but she was the leader of the church at Cenchreae, which is right near Corinth. So you begin to see him picking different people to lead various communities. We also are familiar with Timothy and Titus from the letters to Timothy and Titus. But loose structure. It was around 50 that the Council of Jerusalem was the first council, and they were debating about whether are we simply Christians as part of Christianity or within the Jewish community, or do we go to the Gentiles? And of course, it's there that Paul argued that Gentiles are believing, so we ought to go to the Gentiles. And they shouldn't have to go through all the Jewish practices. We just go ahead and baptize them. He and Peter had a major fight over that. Peter was like, I don't know, I'm Jewish in background, I don't like this. And Paul said, he stomped out and said, okay, I'm just leaving. I'm going ahead and go do it. So you see tensions in the church between Peter and Paul, 2 great giants, later having reconciliation with each other. And Peter eventually agreed with Paul to say, okay, that's what we need to do. But that was a major turning point for the early church, including diverse members, to lead to Gentile acceptance. So Paul takes off after that, and for the next 15 or so years is traveling all over what is present-day Turkey and Greece, establishing communities. And the Christian community is kind of rapidly changing from a Near Eastern mentality, because most of the first Christians were Near Eastern, to a more Greco-Roman culture and mentality. And the words and the concepts of the church began to be used into that culture. That will come back as something that causes tension because the Greco-Roman culture, European culture, and Near Eastern culture is very, very different thinking patterns, and that's what ultimately split the Roman Empire between those cultures into the East and the West. It's going to have the same effect in the church. So we're not the first people dealing with diversity. The early church was doing that. But by the end of the first century, the church had spread across the Mediterranean Sea, across the north of Africa, with lots of communities, over to Spain, up beginning into France, and of course Italy. Still hadn't gone into Germany much or beyond that. To some extent, there is some record of people like St. Thomas going to India. And there's at least some roots that somehow went in that direction to Babylon, Iraq, and India, where early church Christian communities were formed. So the church is kind of expanding, but it's still kind of underground. It's not enormous amounts of people. It's, of course, during this time that the four Gospels are developed in the last part of the first century. I won't go into that tonight. Did that the last time I was here. But the Gospels become kind of the Torah, if you will, for Christians. The four Gospels, the core of Christian teaching. There's still very little specific doctrine. There's no catechisms during this particular time. It's more pastoral development and people learning from each other. The liturgy, Eucharist, oftentimes people might go to a synagogue service and then later on they'd have a service in their homes where they would have Eucharist. So the whole liturgy of the Word was developed out of the synagogue service, and then in the home, the table worship around a table, a dinner table, a meal, sharing Eucharist with one another. Gradually, as Christians got separated from that, the liturgy of the Word was combined with the liturgy of table, the liturgy of Eucharist, in the same kind of ceremony. But it was always in homes, so it was kind of, we would say today, somewhat loosey-goosey in the sense of people, while there was some formal prayers, there was no ritual, no sacramentary, no lectionary as we know it at that time. That comes much later, actually centuries later. So Christians gathered for the Word and to break the bread. Okay. Whoops. Yeah, okay. Some of the primary leaders during this particular time, I said Paul and his successors, obviously. John, the apostle, sometimes known as the mystic, who wrote the Gospel of John, he ends up for a time in Ephesus, which is on the west coast of Turkey. Amazing city today. They've just uncovered the ruins in the last 50 years. It was a city of almost 1 million people, and one of the largest cities of the known world at that time. Fascinating. But John had his followers, Paul had his followers, and obviously Peter had his followers. And if you read the writings of the three of them, they are very different. Because they're three different men. There's three different theologies, if you will, that sometimes come in conflict. The way Paul sees things, the way Peter sees things. Peter tends to try to, let's preserve things, so we might say he's more of a conservative in the idea of preservative. Paul is more the cutting edge. Well, what if we do this? What if we do this? Let's break this barrier. Let's get beyond this area. And John is kind of more the spiritual. He looks at Jesus as the divine one in his gospel, but there are followers of him as well. So it's not just one way of thinking. It's three different people doing that. But in the early church, Peter, obviously as the first among the disciples, eventually ends up in Rome. Paul might have got there before Peter, although they got there about the same time. They're both killed in Rome. Peter, of course, is killed on Vatican Hill. That's where he was buried, and that's why St. Peter's Church is on Vatican Hill. Paul was beheaded outside the city limits because he was a citizen, a Roman citizen, and could not be killed inside the city. But it's the city of Peter and Paul. We think about Peter, but it's both Peter and Paul. Paul VI, St. Paul VI, often said, when he took the name of Paul, he said, remember, Rome is the city of both Peter and Paul, and you need both. And sometimes we haven't always recognized that. So there were other leaders during the first centuries, the next couple of centuries. Irenaeus, I wish I could go into some of these characters. Clement, who became one of the successors of Peter. One of the major writers was the Shepherd of Hermes. Ignatius of Antioch is famous in the 2nd century. And later centuries, people like Origen and Cyprian of Carthage, which is northern Africa. So the African church was very consequential in the early church, and the roots of a lot of African-American liturgy today come out of that northern African experience. St. Augustine's, of course, was from northern Africa, from Hippo in northern Africa, as we will later hear. So it begins at the end of the 1st century, we begin to see 3 roles appear. The role of deacon, which we see in the Acts of the Apostles. The deacon was kind of the social worker, if you will. He should deal with the physical needs of people and distributing those needs to other people. The priest was the rabbi figure, the teacher, leading them in the tradition. And the bishop was the episkopoi. We get episcopal. The word episkopoi means one with oversight role. And those 3 roles by the end of the 1st century become clearer. And by the 2nd century, the role of bishop becomes very important as kind of the center of unity of each one of the communities. It was usually only the bishop that celebrated the liturgy, and the priest just kind of concelebrated with him in those centuries. Later, as the church got bigger and bigger and bigger, then the priests were celebrating liturgy in separate communities. But that's a later development in one sense. And the bishops, as that role of they always trace their heritage back to, well, I succeeded so-and-so. Who succeeded so-and-so, who succeeded so-and-so is what we call apostolic succession. And every bishop can trace back through history the bishop who consecrated him and who consecrated him to say there is a line of history between all of that. Gets a little sketchy sometimes in some of our history, but it's an important thing of how do we preserve our connection with the past. As I said, there is evidence that women served as deaconesses during this time. There's still questions, as we're still studying today, about who was ordained and who wasn't ordained. Ordination seems to come more clearly after the 3rd century. But there was a laying on of hands that we see kind of designating certain people. We just are not sure necessarily about whether all the deaconesses were ordained, but there seems to be some evidence that some were. So could we have deacons today? That's part of the question that Pope Francis continues to deal with. But from time to time, persecutions kept occurring, and off and on within this underground church, and sometimes the church would have to hide and scatter. But it wasn't continuous, so sometimes they could be a little bit more public about what they were doing, but it was not until roughly the Constantine that the church could be now more public. So what do we learn from that first era of the church? Era, not error. Just make sure everybody understands what I'm saying. Interesting, during these first 300 years, there is little doctrine or structure as we know it, but it's developing. People are passing things on. from family, just like we tell family stories. The stories are being collected. And obviously, even the scriptures were being formalized, the Gospels pretty much, and the letters before this period of time. But the scriptures were not fully accepted as canonical as we have it today until the 300s. So it's not quite as clear as we sometimes think. New ministries are being developed. Deacons, presbyters, episcopae. Communities are being formed and shaped under persecution. So when you're under persecution, you're very defensive about keeping the group together. And sometimes that helps you, as sometimes it also hurts you. As I said, there are diverse theologies, not just one single theology. And sometimes those theologies clashed. Bishops take on the role, certainly by the 2nd century, as the prime teacher, and one of the prime roles of a bishop is to be the teacher of a particular diocese, the preacher. Of course, bishops, for the most part, were elected by the people and then offered as this is the person who should lead us because of their gifts. They had an ability to preach or to teach, and therefore that's who we want to be the leader of our community. Rome was not picking bishops as we think of today during this particular time. There was very little connection, obviously, between the city of Rome and the outskirts of this. But bishops became very, very important. Spirituality is also, there's always this kind of counterculture movement going on in the church. And the idea of a monastic community was beginning to be developed in the 2nd and 3rd century. And what we call the Desert Fathers, sometimes in some places they would go out into the wilderness, into deserted places. They may not be deserts, but to say we need to get away from the cities. There are too many distractions in the cities, so we can focus on what are we really supposed to be talking about? The scriptures and how is God acting in our lives? They act as a balance sometimes to the obviously politics in the best sense of that term that happens within communities. And every time you get a community together, there is political relationships because that's how we come to some agreements as families and as communities. So it seems like this is being led by the Spirit in lots of ways. The weaknesses, of course, is there's very little structure. As I said, no ordination in a formal sense as we know. That's going to cause some challenges. No centralized leader. People would write to the Bishop of Rome and his successor about things, but it's not like, tell us what to do. They're just kind of saying, well, this is what we're doing. What are you doing over there? So we can learn from one another. The bishop was kind of Rome was the first among equals because he's the successor of Peter, but not necessarily of the pyramid that he's over everyone else. They didn't think in that way. And of course, there is the split between the mother Judaism and this new sect of Christianity. Question that came up often is when people become Christians, but then under persecution, they say, I'm going to get killed if I admit that I'm a Christian. So, no, I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in Christianity. I'll worship any Roman idol you want me to do. I want to stay alive. We call those apostates. And then how does the community accept somebody back in? That was a real question. Well, you've separated yourself. You denied it. You excommunicated yourself. How do we deal with that? Gradually, there became a process, much like we call the catechumenate, of saying, okay, there are steps you need to go through before you are accepted back into the community. How do we forgive? 7 times, 70 times 7. What's going to happen also during this period of time is that cultural difference between the Near East, which is basically Turkey to the Near East, and Greece and Europe, that separation ultimately separates the Roman Empire. And so there is a ruler in Constantinople, and there's a ruler in Rome. And pretty soon the city of Rome is just going to crumble. And the only one left in Rome is going to be the Bishop of Rome, which is what happens in the next century. So that's kind of basically the first 3 decades. Have I completely confused you at this point? You kind of see where there are many things we can learn out of their pluses and minuses of that era. Okay, moving on. We're doing okay. The second era is around 313. Constantine wins a battle at the Milvian Bridge, and by legend saw something in the sky that looked like a cross. He was thinking about becoming a Christian. He was not a Christian at the time. "In this sign you may conquer," and with that sign he won a battle, and therefore he felt like it was important for him to become a Christian. And so he started to become a catechumen. Now, he was a catechumen for 33 years. Thank God we don't require people to go through 33 years of education to join the church. But part of that was, at the time, once you got baptized, we didn't have a Sacrament of Reconciliation. That, if you go into serious sin, how are you going to be reconciled with the church? And he hedged his bets for a while. So he said, "Well, I'm going to wait until I'm near death." And of course, he gets baptized near his death, but he was ultimately baptized. That's the way people work sometimes. But with Constantine being the emperor, suddenly Christianity is not under persecution. And because he's becoming a Christian and does become a Christian, Christianity now becomes the religion of the realm, if you will. Now that's going to add some good things because it can now be public, but the state is also going to have a say about the church and what it does, and that's going to cause problems as well. So the church moves from being an underground to a privileged place, and church buildings are starting to be built during this time. It's not too long after that one of the first St. Peter's in Rome, the first church where St. Peter's is, was built by Constantine and under what is now the second St. Peter's that was built in the 16th century. And his mother, Helena, as you know, or Helen, went to Israel and built several churches in Israel, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is over the burial site and the crucifixion site of Jesus. An absolute crazy church, has 14 chapels in it. If you've ever been there, you're like, I don't understand this, but there's now several different. There is the Orthodox tradition owns part of it. Christians have part of it. The Coptics have part of it. And there's a battle for who does what. So the person who can open the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a Muslim. He's got the key. Otherwise, everybody's going to fight with everybody. But that church was built by Helena, and we start to see churches being built and the place where the assembly met. And of course, that's when liturgy is going to be a bit more formalized at that point in time. Christians begin to spread throughout Europe, certainly into France, then during this next period of time up into the British Isles as well. But those divisions continue to happen between the Near East and Europe. Basically, you're not respecting our diversity. You're saying we've got to do exactly everything the way you do it, and we like to do it differently. We like to enculturate our liturgy. And of course, That's going to lead to the division we have today between the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Doesn't happen formally until the 11th century, but was basically not over theology, but over respect for diversity in liturgy, because the Orthodox Church has several different rites. Our Roman Catholic Church actually now has several different rites, but most of us are pretty ignorant of those other rites sometimes. So eventually, by the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire is divided, and the Roman Empire in Rome is going to be going downhill very rapidly. The Roman Empire in Constantinople is still going to be strong, but when Muhammad and the movement of Islam begins to move into that area, it's going to crumble as well. Doctrinal development begins to happen during this period of time as well. Constantine raised the question like, okay, I want to be a Christian. What do we believe? Where's it written down? Give me something to say. And we didn't have that. So he called for a council at Nicaea in 325. It wasn't the Bishop of Rome. It was the Roman Emperor who called for that, to begin to talk about what do we believe. And over the next 2 centuries, we had 4 major councils: Nicaea, Constantinople, you can hear the east for that. Ephesus, Nicaea was also in the east. Later on, Ephesus and Chalcedon. And over those 4 councils was developed what we celebrate every Sunday as the Nicene Creed. It goes back 1,500 years to say, this is what we say we believe. Nicaea tried to talk about the divinity of Christ, that Jesus was divine. There were many heresies saying, oh, well, he was human being, but he wasn't really divine. And perhaps as much as half the church wasn't sure about that. Council of Nicaea said Jesus is true God and true man. And he has a relationship with the Father and the Spirit. That big word we say, consubstantial. They're of the same essence. Later, Constantinople defined the divinity of the Holy Spirit because some people said, we're not sure the Spirit is divine. There was a heresy that said that. Ephesus in 431 said the mother of Christ is the mother of God. Mary is the mother of God. Well, obviously God existed far before Mary, but her body gave the human flesh to God in our midst. Chalcedon, again, talks about those 2 natures, the divine nature and the human nature. I'm not going to deal with that doctrine because it's one that still we struggle with. Okay, if Jesus is God, how can he be man? If he's man, how can he be God? That's for another time and another place. But that's what the church was dealing with, and we're talking about 500 years after Jesus' birth that we're just coming to an understanding of what the church is all about. The doctrinal development, as I said, I've mentioned Arianism denied the divinity of Christ, of Jesus. Pelagianism, and Pope Francis has used this term several times. We still have Pelagians with us. Basically said that I earn God's grace by my good works, and therefore God owes me heaven. And we don't believe that. That's not part of the church. But I've unfortunately heard some Catholics in parishes I've been in say, well, God owes me heaven because I did all these good things. No, heaven is a gift. God gives us that gift. We do good works because God loves us first. So we don't earn grace by our works. Pope Francis says that still is a heresy among us sometimes. Manichaeism believed that the body was all bad, and the soul is all good. And of course you can see how when you start looking at that, then all sexuality is bad and anything that's spiritual is good. Well, we're both body and soul. The body is not bad in itself. God created it good. Some of those heresies have repeated over the years as well. And the fourth one is what we call Gnosticism. And again, Pope Francis says we got to be worried about that. That still happens. That some people say, well, we have the knowledge. We've got it together. We know exactly what we believe. And if you don't believe the way we believe it, you're not with us. But we have the knowledge, and once we have the knowledge, we're the chosen few. So often that lacks humility, and that I have a certain knowledge and nobody else has it, and you don't have it. That heresy also grew during this time. So I think it's kind of interesting to see that some of the very things that we struggle with today, they were struggling with 1,000, 1,500 years ago. So it's also during this period of time that in the last part of the 300s and 400s that the canon of the Bible, for us 72 books of Old and New Testament, were set. Now there are other books that were not accepted as canonical. You hear them every once in a while. There's the gospel of various things, and those books exist. But even if you pick them up and read them, and there's copies of those still around, the quality of those compared to the quality of the four gospels is very evident. Most of them are kind of collection of legends, so the church did not accept them as such. It's also another counterculture movement that happens during this time as the church becomes more public, unfortunately more connected to the state, and sometimes the state wants to control the church. That's always a challenge. Sometimes the church wants to control the state. That can be a challenge as well. Was the rise of another form of monasticism we call Western monasticism that come out of St. Benedict. St. Benedict was one of the real giants, wrote a rule for his order. There was an order of religious men and there's an order of religious women. Benedict had some were priests, some were brothers, and that monastic movement and his leadership began to influence the church greatly during that time. And people flocked to monasteries, as they sometimes do today, to say, teach us what we need to know, because they became the real teachers of the time, but kind of a counteraction sometimes to the political battles that go on between church and state outside of that. And it's also during this time that you begin to see a more formal development of the liturgy. Now that you have churches, you have particular roles within the Eucharist, the liturgy of the Word, the liturgy of Eucharist and the table is more formalized, and rituals and the catechumenate, the rite of Christian initiation for adults, was formalized during this period of time and mostly used. You can see that some of the things that are happening during these centuries were what Vatican II was trying to do, to say, we need to get back and look at our whole history of liturgy, and looking at the history of those first centuries, what was liturgy about, and how do we bring out of our store room the best of our tradition. And some of the reforms of the Second Vatican Council to the Tridentine Latin Mass that we all remember, that's 16th century, was saying we got to go back to the 4th and 5th century and see how they did some things. That's part of our history, and maybe there's something we've lost from that. So sometimes there's a stereotype out there that, Vatican II was radical and, it tried to upset the traditions of the church. Well, it was looking at another tradition that was far earlier. Remember the joke of sometimes when Father Dick Fowler started the Church of Epiphany, the glass church, which is shaped into an octagon, and someone said, "Oh, that's way too modern. That's not Catholic at all, because it doesn't look like Holy Spirit or whatever." And Dick, of course, used the model of St. Sabinus, which is in Rome, which is an octagon church that goes back to the 4th century. So the Epiphany model is more traditional than Holy Spirit. I can get in big trouble for saying that, but that's the truth if you know the history of it. So some of our liturgical battles sometimes is we don't know our own history sometimes. As I said, the city of Rome declines. It was 1 million people roughly in the 1st century, around 50 of the 1st century. During these next couple of eras, it's going down to a city of less than 10,000. And the only thing left in Rome was on Vatican Hill. It was the Bishop of Rome. So he's the only power left in Rome that tries to hold the city of Rome together sometimes. That's part of why the Vatican has been so important to Roman history. Some of the primary leaders, I said Constantine and his mother Helena. Later on, Augustine in the late 400s, early 500s, was a convert, as you know. His mother Monica prayed for him all the time. He eventually went through the catechumenate and was baptized by Ambrose, and then goes back to Africa, Hippo, where he's from, is elected bishop by his people, and is famous for, he's probably the dominant theologian of the next 500 years or so from his own writings. And there are some marvelous writings, but of course, as you know, like a reformed alcoholic, Augustine did everything. He did more sinnings than probably most of us have ever thought about doing in his younger days. And therefore, in reaction to that, sometimes he had some very negative ideas about sexuality that still affect some of the thinking in our church from time to time. But that's not to say, he's the person that came up with the notion of the idea of sacrament, sacramentum, a sacred moment. How do we celebrate such sacraments in our lives? So again, a giant of that time. Benedict and his twin sister, Scholastica, beginning to establish the Benedictines, who all praise to St. Meinrad's, our neighbors to the west. St. Jerome is a fascinating scripture scholar during this time, an interesting man who translated the entire Bible into Latin. If you can imagine, if you take one of your Bibles and think, how would I translate a book that thick, 72 different books from original languages into one language, the Vulgate, which became kind of the source book in lots of ways for us in many ways. Lived for the most of his life in Jerusalem, down in the caves underneath in Bethlehem. If you ever go to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, obviously you'll find the place where by tradition Jesus was born, but under that whole church there's a whole cave system, and that's where Jerome did most of his work. There's a chapel to St. Jerome under there. Fascinating person as kind of the first great scripture scholar of this era, who set the groundwork for many other scripture scholars. Another great giant, got to give a little shout out to Gregory the Great. There's a parish in Samuels that I was administrator of that's dedicated to Gregory the Great. Again, another interesting man who was a very spiritual man. It's out of him that we get Gregorian chant. But also when some of the barbarians were coming to the city, Gregory went out to meet them and said, this city has a lot of history. I ask you not to destroy it. And they didn't. By the power of his own personality and his ability to talk with some of the barbarians, they seemed to respect this holy man. So that's why he's often called Gregory the Great, because at the turn of the 500s, he was a very powerful person. And of course, today being Patrick and Bridget of Ireland, Patrick was sent as a missionary to Ireland to convert that. Another Augustine, not Augustine of Hippo, but Augustine of Canterbury, converted most of the British Isles, but Patrick, of course, is famous for Ireland. So you begin to see these missionaries changing people's lives. So what do we get out of this? The strengths and the weaknesses of this era. And we're doing fairly good. Christianity grows to the known world. It becomes one of the most influential, obviously. There are some schisms that happen. There are people who split from the church, but they're very short-lived. So the Protestant Reformation was not the first time that there are schisms. Monastic spirituality calls people back to simplicity and core beliefs and core values, much like Pope Francis keeps talking about. Some of our core doctrines were clarified through a synodal structure, having a council. Let's discuss this. Let's come up with what do we believe? What's our consensus about all of this? So the word synod was a very important thing during this era, and that's a word you hear Pope Francis using often. We need to have a synodal church. There's going to be a synod next year on synodality. That every parish or maybe every diocese should have a synod to decide what this particular diocese should be doing. That goes back to these centuries. Liturgical life developed this active participation of people, a variety of ministries. The sacraments begin to develop during this period of time, although we still haven't defined 7 sacraments at this point in time. But certainly baptism and Eucharist were fundamental sacraments. It's later in this period that reconciliation, thank God for the Irish, kind of helped us with that. And what we call individual confession was developed to say, okay, how do we heal people if they've been away from the church or if they're major sinners? What's the process that we used? For a while, they'd have to separate from the church. Then the Irish priest said, well, we'll give you your penance, we'll give you absolution, and then go do your penance, rather than do your penance and then come back for absolution, a development in the Sacrament of Reconciliation at the time. And the catechumenal was the process that we used to accept people into the church. So the classic development of structures of the church, much of it adapted from the Roman culture. So things like diocese is a term that comes from Rome, a Roman culture. So the church always kind of takes things from every culture and adapts it to how it might work. Obviously, the weaknesses is tensions of heresies and schisms begin to arise. Tensions continue between the European church and the Near Eastern cultural mentalities. There's constant pressure of the political society and the state trying to say, well, I'd like to name the bishop over here because he's my friend, or he'll do what I want him to do. And do bishops become the representatives of the state, or are they separate from that? How do we do that? The church struggled with this greatly. How do we have the state not control the church? There is corruption. There is sin. We're all fallible human beings within the church. That causes challenges. But there's also a new missionary zeal, much like there was in the first century, to spread the good news to other cultures, especially through Germany and into what we call Eastern Europe, and even up into what we call Russia today. Sometimes that missionary zeal, they went and baptized a lot of people without having given them a lot of depth. And sometimes they didn't always respect the cultures that they were representing, but imposed their culture on whatever culture they were dealing with. That will cause problems. Okay. Third era. So we're halfway through this evening. Are you still with me? It looks like everybody's still awake here. I don't know about you at home, but hopefully. So the third era goes from around 600 to 1100. This is the time of the Dark Ages, and I'll explain that in a little bit. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, many of what were called barbarians, some of the tribal communities in the northern part of Europe began to move south and east and invade these countries, destroying cities, sometimes destroying churches, destroying monasteries and schools. And unfortunately, we didn't have safety deposit boxes back then. I don't know whether we still have them today. They're getting rid of all of those things. But in terms of how do we preserve our culture, so a lot of times people would just bury in the ground books and various things to preserve instruments of the past. But if your community gets killed and nobody knows where the burial ground is, those things get lost. And it's interesting how lots of things, lots of the ancient culture of Greece and Rome, Aristotle, the great philosophers, gets lost during this period of time. They will be rediscovered in a couple of centuries, and we're still rediscovering things in the last 150 years, things that were buried during this period of time. But suddenly there's this kind of gloom and doom that sets over the church and the culture because everything we've known has been destroyed. Now, the barbarians kind of come and go. They don't stay. They go back to their homeland and people have to rebuild. The other kind of thing that's happening in the 600s is that with the rise of Muhammad, began to rise of Islam and the Muslim religion. As an Abrahamic religion, he saw the roots of the Bible as much. We talk about Jews being an Abrahamic religion. Abraham is our father. Christianity would say the same. And Islam says the same, that we have our roots together. But in the story of Genesis, when Abraham had Sarah as a wife and Hagar, and sends Hagar away, sometimes our Muslim brothers and sisters identify with that part, Hagar's family, rather than Sarah's family, that kind of split us. But some of the principles are in common, and we have probably a lot more in common with our Muslim brothers and sisters than we sometimes understand. But obviously, as the Muslim tradition grows, it begins to move and take over all of the Near East, and especially what we call Israel and the Holy Land, and then begins to move across Africa, destroying most of the churches and most of the church's presence in northern Africa, moves into Spain for a while, and then gets thrown back into across the Mediterranean Sea. So much of the roots of the African church get lost during this period of time. Again, the monastic life continues to grow and develop. Great monasteries like Cologne in France around 900 the monasteries try to be the places where we can preserve the best in our tradition. And monasteries are still that way, and sometimes in terms of their archives of what they preserve is amazing sometimes. And thank God somebody's trying to preserve our history, because some people don't do that very well. But unfortunately, there's a lack of educational resources, so there's a lack of schools and education, and so people are not well educated during this period of time. That begins this Dark Ages. And we begin to also see the liturgy change because of that gloom and tomb. Instead of the community being gathered as they were in the 4th and 5th century around an altar, kind of in a semicircle, as we've seen a lot of churches develop over the years, suddenly, because God must be punishing us, we've got to separate ourselves from God, and things like separation points come into churches. Well, there needs to be a wall here, and God's presence is on the other side, but we're unworthy, so we're going to stay on this side. And that begins to separate the clergy from the laity in many ways, as well as God is out there, but we're unworthy to be present before God. And obviously, as that happens, people go to communion less and less because I am not worthy of that. So there's a huge change that happens in lots of areas. It's also the beginning in this culture of feudalism. You've all heard of that, which is a caste system. One of the great books that's come out in the last year is Caste, and the castes that are within our society, and there are more castes than we sometimes admit in our society. I'm not going to go into that. But feudalism was a definite caste system and a very hierarchical system. The elites are on top, and then there's a bottom group that are the peasant class. And you don't go from the peasant class to the elite class, it becomes separated. And we see that in the feudal society. We also see the church kind of adopting that as well during this period of time, a feudalism, what today we might call clericalism sometimes. Famous missionary Boniface evangelizes around 700 to 800 Germany, and eventually Germany becomes a Christian community. And when Charlemagne becomes emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, he wants the Pope to come and crown him as the Holy Roman Emperor. But of course, when the Pope comes and starts to put the crown on him, just to make sure the Pope knows who's boss, he took the crown and put it on himself. To say, no, you don't put it on me, you just bring it to me and I put it on there, which tells you something in terms of Charles the Great. But the Holy Roman Emperor is developed at that time. Around the turn of the millennium, in 1054 is when the Eastern and Western churches split, what we call the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Again, several of our popes, from John Paul II and Benedict as well as Francis, have been saying, how can we bring the Orthodox and the Christian and the Roman Catholic Church back together again? And lots of progress has been made, especially in recent years, but we're still a long way. But it's not a battle over, most of our theology is, we don't fight over theology. The Orthodox tradition tends to emphasize more the resurrection. So in their churches, there's much more a resurrected Jesus, whereas the Roman Catholic Church is more emphasized Good Friday and the Jesus of Good Friday. Well, it's both. But how do we recognize it's both and? Pope Nicholas II created a college of cardinals to elect a pope from the city of Rome. Again, not a whole lot of people in Rome, but he picked that college, made cardinals mostly around Italy, mostly close to Rome, and each one would have a church in Rome to elect the next pope. It's come a long way from the 11th century in terms of now Francis tries to get somebody from every country, and sometimes some of the most insignificant countries, to make sure that someone has a say in electing whoever the next pope is. William the Conqueror of France takes over England from Edward the Confessor. Since I was former pastor of St. Edward's, I've got to put Edwards in there just to make sure he gets in there as well. The German Pope Gregory the Seventh in 1078 creates, he was the first German Pope. Benedict was our last German Pope, Benedict XVI. And Germans are very good at making distinctions and making law, and he established what we call canon law in the church. And his purpose in that is to say, here's the church's role, and here's the state's role, because he wanted to separate the church from the state so the state is not controlling the church. And he used it by using canon law. That's canon with one N, not two N's, like the gun. And the church has had canon law for 1,100 years, but we didn't have a universal code of canon law until 1917. And that was revised in 1983. And there'll probably be another revision coming sometime in the next 10 or 15 years. It needs to be revised again, as it always has to be, because things change. Also, another great missionaries beside Boniface was Cyril and Methodius. Their feast day is February 14th. Somehow Valentine's gets in there, but it's really the feast of Cyril and Methodius. I'd like to start at Cyril and Methodius cards and see maybe if we can make some money, but I have my doubts about that. So what are the strengths that we see of this particular era? Strengths in one sense that Italy and Rome become a backwater in influence. Obviously the Bishop Rome is there, or the Vatican remains, but other parts, France and Germany, become much more influential to the church, and even up into England and Ireland, and some of the Baltic nations as well. And Italy is just not as important as it was in the beginning. The monastic movement continues to flourish with kind of core spirituality and preaching. They kind of hold on to the tradition, and thank God we've got the monastic communities to do that for us. They're invaluable about that. But Christianity also begins to spread up into Northern and Eastern Europe and beyond in that direction for the first time. So it's a dark ages, but a missionary age. Weaknesses, of course, is we lose a lot of records in our history of Egypt and Rome and Greece. Much of those cultural roots and, if you will, educational roots get lost. The pyramid structure of society becomes kind of the norm for all society, that, you know, someone needs to be on top and there are layers underneath it, but it is a pyramid, it's not a circle. And the church adapts that. By this time, clergy and laity have very separate roles and sometimes very separate dress, very separate status in the church, different from the early church. North Africa and lands surrounding Israel are lost to the church during that time. So it's a very difficult time, but the next era begins to make some changes. And we're doing well. We got 20 minutes to go. Or do you need to have a quick stand-up break? Would that be helpful for you? Are you? Keep on going? I'm sure you at home are taking your breaks whenever you need it. Okay. So the last era that we're going to deal with tonight is 1100 to 1492. I could have picked 500, but 1492 sticks. These 400 years, we begin to come out of the Dark Ages. In the 1100s, of course, as many of the monarchies become stronger and with merchants beginning to be more money in Europe, kings begin to say, we've got to take back the Holy Land. So I want to create an army to go and take it away from those infidels. And of course, this is a period of time of the Crusades, which is kind of a dark period in many ways, because a lot of the people that went into these armies were mercenaries. They really didn't care about the cause or the church. They just wanted to get paid. And unfortunately, were warriors, and when they went into areas, they wiped out everybody. They wiped out Muslims, they wiped out Jews. The Crusades were a very dark history for us in so many different ways. And we pay a price for that with our Jewish brothers and sisters as well as with our Muslim brothers and sisters. But we've done a lot of confessing that. Europe becomes an economic engine, and there's a cultural rebirth. We call it the Renaissance, which leads to more and more affluence, which leads to more interest in education, building great buildings, and many of the great cathedrals were built during this time. Notre Dame in Paris is the classic example in the 11th century, as we learned so much about that after the fire last year. The cathedral in Cologne, obviously later on there'll be several churches in Rome as well, and eventually St. Peter's. And we also begin to see that counterculture movement in the church, kind of against the affluence, because money and affluence can corrupt us and the church, as we know all too well. With the rise of many new religious orders, especially in the 1200s, the most famous being Francis of Assisi, who was considered a total kook when he established the Franciscans. This guy is a loose cannon, and yet later becomes kind of one of the dominant saints. St. Dominic establishes the order of preachers during this time. It's always dangerous for the church to call some people loose cannons, because they come back sometimes to haunt you later on as the great giants of the church, when they were thought to be way off in the woods, as Francis kept trying to call us back to simplicity, care for creation, and it's very interesting Pope Francis took that name, especially at this point in time. But those religious orders began to expand. Dominic, as an order of preachers, also was very interested in education, and some of the great giants in education and the beginning of many universities in Europe began to be established under the Dominicans. Later in the 16th century, we'll have the Jesuits, but that's tomorrow, that's not tonight. So Renaissance hunger for education leads to these great universities: Paris, Bologna, Milan, Geneva, and the rise of great theologians during this time. Theologians were called magisters, which means a teacher. You've probably heard the term often our church uses, the magisterium of the church. And that's a legitimate term. It's the teaching of the church, but that's borrowed from the teaching of the professors in the universities, like the magisterium of Thomas Aquinas. So you had some of the great heroes of Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, Duns Scotus. During this time, Thomas, again, was one of those interesting figures. My confirmation name is Thomas Aquinas, because I was fascinated in the second grade that he was called the dumb ox, but it was really bright. I don't know why, but why do you do that in the second grade? I don't know. But later on, reading his writings, it's just amazing what the man wrote, and how he could kind of take in Aristotelian philosophical terms, kind of re-look at all of our doctrine in the 13th century and articulate it in a new way. His masterful list, how do you prove the existence of God? And he has 7 proofs of the existence of God, and each of them are kind of fascinating. And then when he concludes it, it says, but none of these absolutely prove the existence of God. But you can't disprove the existence of God either. Love it, the way he thought about some things. But Thomas Aquinas was one of those people who was almost condemned by a pope as a heretic. And the only reason that didn't happen is the pope died before he signed the papers, and the next pope never signed the papers. And now St. Thomas Aquinas is famous for his theology and philosophy over the age. So again, got to be careful sometimes. Of course, it's also the time of great art and architecture and discoveries of some of those past cultures of Rome and Greece. Philosophy began to be rediscovered places, and people began to use them in universities. But again, primarily all European, because that's where the church was at this period of time, and not in some of the other cultures. In 1347 to 50, the bubonic plague, since we've just been through part of that and still undergoing that, more than a third of Europe died in that plague. So as bad as we sometimes think it is now, and it is terribly bad, that was a horrendous time. So there's a development of a much more hierarchical structure church during this period of time, building upon feudal principles, of course. And the papacy begins to be much more centralized. Rome begins to be gradually built back as a city, although still it wasn't a dominant city at this time. And the term of Holy Father, Papa, the Pope, begins to be used, and other such terms as the Vicar of Christ. Some of the terms that were not used in the first century. As Pope Francis says often, my first title is the Bishop of Rome. That's who I am, the Bishop of Rome. And sometimes we forget that. It's not the Vicar of Christ necessarily, but he is a bishop and the first among the equals. During this period of time, there's 11 ecumenical councils. Not all of them are terribly important to us, but we're having a council about every 50 years or so to decide on certain doctrines. First Lateran, of course, in 1123, made clerical celibacy in the church a requirement for all priests. Before that, it was religious priests, obviously took the vow of celibacy, but diocesan priests, like Father Brendan and I, were not required to be celibate. This is when celibacy entered the church, and just not even 900 years ago. Some of the great leaders during this time, Bernard of Clairvaux, established the Cistercians, the Trappists, as kind of a form of the order of strict observance of some Benedictine principles in the 1100s. Innocent III, Pope Innocent III, reformed the sacraments. Again, I mentioned Clare and Francis of Assisi. Clare is a fascinating person. If you've ever been to Assisi, one end of the town is dedicated to Francis. The other end is Clare. I really like Clare's end of town. And the monastery there is so simple. And Clare built her monastery outside the walls of the city, and everybody said, "You're an order of religious women. You need to be inside the wall to be protected." She said, "I can take care of myself." Powerful woman. Some of the other great women, and Catherine of Siena, as you know, was a lay woman who became a third order Dominican, but famous for her writings, and she would go and see the Pope every once in a while and tell him, "Now this is what you need to be doing." And during the Pope during this period of time was imprisoned in Avignon in France for almost 70 plus years, and Catherine gets up and goes over to Avignon and says, "Get back to Rome. We need you back in Rome." And the Pope said, okay, I'll do that. So there are some very interesting characters. Roger Bacon was a priest who was a great scientist and started much of the scientific movement. So the 13th century, there are just all kinds of things that happened during this time. Meanwhile, in the Near East, the Ottoman Turks are now growing in power. Obviously, you know that Francis goes and sees one of them to try to help get the Holy Land and see if the Franciscans can come back to the Holy Land, and ultimately succeeded in doing that. But you begin to see resistance to many different things that are happening in the church. Boniface the Eighth was a pope. There was a lot of resistance to the Babylonian Avignon captivity that I mentioned, not Babylon, but Avignon. The Great Schism, for a while in that century, there were 3 popes. And who's pope? And finally, they got all 3 to resign so they could elect 1 pope around 1451. So you begin to see a lot of the seeds of the Reformation are beginning to happen in terms of there is a lot of corruption that happens during this time in the papacy. Alexander VI, the Borgia, is probably the most infamous pope we've ever had. I won't go into his history, but whatever you can guess is bad, Alexander did in lots of ways. And the Borgias controlled the papacy in lots of ways. Great families sometimes controlled it. And it's interesting how there's all kinds of nepotism going on. Charles Borromeo, one of the great reformers in the next century, was the nephew of one of the popes. So the pope made him the Cardinal Archbishop of Milan when he was like 23. He hadn't even been ordained a priest yet, but he appoints him as cardinal and all that. So he gets all of that at 23. He ends up being a giant and a great bishop of the time, but who would have thought about that? But there's just so many interesting things that happen. But the seeds of the Reformation happen when the first Slavic reformer that raised a lot of questions about the church, Jan Hus, was killed in 1451. That the way we treat people who dissent was not always the best. The creation of the printing press was kind of like the internet for us in our time. Suddenly in 1440, you could print a Gutenberg Bible, but you could also use that to print all kinds of pamphlets. And it was an easy way of getting publications out. And suddenly that reformed how people were informed about many things. Oops. I talked about the papacy and more interest in family politics and the arts. Some of the strengths and the weaknesses of this particular era, creation of many influential religious orders, some of the giant religious orders that affect us today. Education was lifted up at many levels, not always in the peasant level, but in some, with the arts and historical cultures begin to flourish. There's positive reforms that canon law developed, trying to separate state control from the church. The church begins to expand, trying to focus back on how can we focus on the Far East. There are peoples on the Far East. How can we send missionaries to Asia? And the exploration of new lands, and obviously with Christopher Columbus going the opposite direction, which will be the Americas as well, the church trying to expand. So there's lots of theological and spiritual giants during this time. On the other hand, there's lots of corruption that happens. Affluence becomes distorting and distracting influence on the church and society. Money is the root of evil in lots of ways, and I think we have to watch that even in our churches today. The tension between theology and the development of theology and canon law, which tends to be more legalistic. Sometimes how do we balance that? Does law become more important than theology? But theology has to be ongoing. It has to articulate in new ways because cultures change, understandings change. Theology has to be allowed to be developed and can't be locked in and frozen. We've always had a little bit of a challenge between our theology becoming legalism. The hierarchical church becomes much more clericalized in this, with titles and terms, things like monsignors and cardinals and dress and apparel and accoutrements like that, and power, who has the power and who doesn't have the power, obviously is going to lead to lots of corruption. And that's what many of the reformers saw during this time, and you're going to see that as we move into the next era. So, has this been helpful to some of you? You're still awake. That's good. But a lot to cover tonight. We've got a lot to cover tomorrow night as well, but it won't quite be quite as bad. I've got a couple of minutes for questions, so are there any burning questions that you might want to ask in 4 or 5 minutes? Everything is clear as mud. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Phoebe.
Yes.
I've never heard of Phoebe before.
Well, if you read the New Testament and the letters of Paul mentions Phoebe and to my sister Deacon Phoebe in Cankere. Okay. I wish I could quote the exact, but I think it's Corinthians. But
what was her role?
Well, Cankere was a city not very far from Corinth, but it was a Christian community there, and he put her in charge of that community. So there were other such people like that. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for adding on strengths and weaknesses at the end of each one. You know, that kind of helps us summarize and see the strength of the church during that time, and at the same time weaknesses going on.
Well, her question was, she liked the idea of strengths and weaknesses. We all have that. We all have them in our own lives. But I said, in every era, you've got that tension. So should we be surprised that we have tension now? I don't think so. Tension is not always bad. Crisis is not always bad. The word crisis means an opportunity. And if we take the opportunity, I was with a group of people the other day that said, how many of us in the room knew what Zoom was a year ago? And most of it, no. I thought that's when you zoom in your camera or something like that. And well, now we're using it for all kinds of things. I was at St. Francis of Assisi Parish in February of last year, and in January, and I said, people were saying, we have trouble getting people to meetings. And I said, I think maybe we've got to think outside the box. Maybe we ought to have meetings online. I think they've got things like Zoom and Skype and some of those things where people wouldn't have to race home from work, get their kids to food, change clothes, drive in their car, get to a meeting, come back, and spend all that time when they could, from their home, could come into a meeting and you could accomplish maybe more. Oh, we've never done things that way. Well, now we're starting to do things that way, and maybe we've learned some things out of that in lots of areas that there's been some blessings out of this.
Yes, there have.
Pardon?
I said, yes, there have been blessings.
Oh, yes, and there's been some curses as well.
Oh, yeah.
Well, tomorrow night we will be doing the next 500 years. Some of us in this room have been around for part of that. So we'll see kind of where we are today based on as we go through the Reformation and to our present time. So hopefully this has been helpful and you've learned something out of it.
Well, thank you, Father, and thank you all for coming here. Not a whole lot of folks, but maybe spread the word tomorrow at Mass. And also thank you for all those who are viewing it through live streaming. And if anyone has questions, you can email them to Father Brandon, and he'll get them to Father Joe for tomorrow evening. So we'll see you tomorrow night at 6:30. Thank you.
Why don't we just close in prayer real quickly? Good and gracious God, we thank you for the gift, so many gifts that you give us, and the gift of our own history and all the people upon whose shoulders we stand today. Guide us with your wisdom as we go through the challenges and the crises of our own time. Guide us with that Spirit and renew the face of the earth. In Jesus' name, we so pray.